All right. Migration, key issue 2. Content objective. Identify the principal sources of immigrants during the three main eras of U.S. migration and also describe the history of interregional and intra-regional migration in the United States and other world regions. The ICANN statements. Describe the history of interregional migration in the United States. 2. Describe interregional migration in Russia, Canada, China, and Brazil. 3. Explain why most of the 19th and 20th century migration globally was international or interregional. 4. Describe the main factors why the population center has shifted west and now to the south in the United States. 5. Explain differences among the three different forms of intra-regional migration through the DTM advancement. U.S. has more foreign-born residents than any other country, approximately 43 million as of 2010, growing by 1 million annually. The three main eras of U.S. immigration are first defined by the colonial era. The colonial era in the 17th and 18th centuries, so the 1600s and the 1700s. And most of those migrants are going to be from Europe, about 2 million European. Most of those Europeans were going to be Great British, which accounts for nearly 90% of migration during the colonial period. Then we'll have mass immigration in the late 1800s, the 19th century, and in the 20th century. And those will be from other areas of Europe. Between 1820 and 1920, 32 million people immigrated to the United States. 90% immigrated from Europe. However, they immigrated from different regions, and we'll get to that. And last immigration era is 1960s to today, and those are going to be immigrants that have steadily increased from from roughly two regions of the world. That one being Asia, the other being Latin America. U.S. immigration in the 17th and 18th century. Remember, as I mentioned, 90% came from Great Britain. So when we look at that effect, it affects our cultural landscape in many ways. We can see it in the introduction of, with that came new diseases. About 2 million Britons accounted for 90% of the population by 1840. 650,000 Africans were shipped as slaves, even after the importation was illegal in 1808. And after it was illegal in 1808, another 250,000 Africans were brought to the United States. And these were forced migratory patterns. And most of it was because of the lack of indentured servants being successful in the United States for colonial America. All right, when we look at immigration in the mid-19th century, we look at 1840s and 50s, represented largely by 3/4 of all U.S. immigrants came from Ireland, Germany, for economic push factors. Germans also immigrated because of political unrest. And as they came across, remember this is relocation diffusion, with that they'll take their religion of Protestantism. In the 1880s and 1890s are represented by Northern and Western Europeans. Primarily, 2/3, or about 50,000 per year, of Scandinavians came across. Swedes and Norwegians, because of the Industrial Revolution, had diffused to Scandinavia, triggering a rapid population increase in migration to the United States. In the 1900s to the 1914, the beginning of World War I, 2/3 of immigrants during this period came from Southern and Eastern Europe. Those countries would have been Italy, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. Again, it was because of the diffusion of the Industrial Revolution in Southern and Eastern Europe, along with rapid population growth. And remember what Zelensky said, stage 2 is when we see international migration, and that destination would have been pull factors to the U.S. for jobs, economic opportunities. We can take a look at Europeans comprising roughly 90% of immigrants in the U.S. in the 19th century. Since the 1980s, we've seen largely Latin American and Asians are the dominant source of migrants. We can see the largest net in is Texas, followed by Florida and California and New York State. We look at the late 20th century, we begin to see Latin American and Asian people or natives. When we look at Asia, mostly China being the largest source, followed by the Philippines, India, and Vietnam. We look at Latin America, largely from Mexico, but from other Spanish-speaking Central American countries as well, like Dominican Republic and Haiti. And we also see brain drain. Brain drain is when the smartest and brightest are taken away from their country and thus leaving future generations absent of their doctors and their lawyers and their high-skilled labor. And when we look at brain drain, we see a quarter of all doctors in Chicago are Ethiopian. That'd be an example of brain drain out of Ethiopia. And these workers are needed for to supply the needed jobs or the workforce in the U.S., the medical jobs. We talked about place utility. Counter migration is the return to their homeland. About 25% will return to their homeland. We look at 2017. The largest foreign-born immigrants come from Asia, 30%. Mexico, close second at 27%. And then followed by other Latin American countries and Europe, and then about 5% African, according to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. Step migration is a series of steps before they get to their final destination. Step migration can happen internationally or it can happen intraregionally. It can happen intraregionally from farms or small towns to suburbs to cities. Those would be 2 stops along the way to their final destination of city, and inter-regional migration. Interregional migration can happen internationally as well. They can go to from their leaving country to several countries in between to their final destination. Chain migration is migration when you have subsequent generation members follow that are related through kinship. So when, let's say, a parent moves here, maybe then their grandparent might follow or their children might follow, and children of their children might follow. That's chain migration. This is common of Asian immigrants as well as Hispanic immigrants. All right, take a look at this example. As already mentioned, we see net in California, New York, Florida, and Texas. And we begin to see a lot of net out in the Great Plains, states like South Dakota, North Dakota, Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana. We can see also some states to the south net out. What is Mexico? Is Minnesota gaining? Is it Minnesota gaining immigrants, or do they have people emigrating? That's right. We have people. We have immigrants, so we have net in. All right, interregional migration. Economic betterment, so economic pull factors is typically the main reason for interregional migration, usually from rural to urban for economic pull factors. Historically, it's been the enticement of the American frontier, gold, the West, the Homestead Act, available land. Presently, it's mostly jobs in urban areas. The westward and southern expansion contributed to a shift of population. So we see the population shift. It continually shift throughout history from the east to the west. The reason for this shift is cheap labor and land, and also Latin American immigrants and high levels of per capita federal spending in the south and the west, and increased demand for resorts and retirement locations. And this shows you our population center as it's shifted throughout this span of from 1790 to 2010. And again, it shifted west, and then now it's starting to shift south, west, and now south. So that tells us half of the population lives to the eastern side of that point, and half the population lives to the western side of that point. Here shows you a flow of most interregional migration in the U.S. in 2017. We can see, again, an increased flow into the south, and then we can see net out in the Midwest. When we look at Russia, Canada, China, and the U.S., the interregional migration is eastward to northward across the Ural Mountains into major cities such as St. Petersburg and Moscow for the new factories, economic pull factors. And here's a choropleth map showing the distribution of the population found on that western side of the Ural Mountains. Interregional migration in Canada is similar to the U.S. It's westward, moving to the west of British Columbia, where there's Vancouver. China is moving from the rural to interior urban cities along the east coast. Brazil is moving inward from Rio de Janeiro to the forward capital of Brasilia. And then in the 19th and 20th century, we see an interregional migration as a result of industrial revolution. Here shows the interregional net migration of moving from the provinces of Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan to British Columbia and Alberta. And there shows the migration from rural to urban centers along the eastern seaboard of China in economic centers like Shanghai and Zhejiang and Guangdong. And there shows the movement from Rio de Janeiro into Brasilia, which would be in the northern region or in the central west region. Interregional migration, since the Industrial Revolution began in the 19th century in more developed countries, remember the medical revolution for developing countries, the percentage of population in the U.S. went from the 1800s 5% to 1920s 50%. And by 2010, 80% of all population sees themselves as urbanites or living in urban areas. And the reason is because of economic advancement and development. Intraregional migration. This began to start in the 1950s in the U.S. People were seeking the movement from city to suburbs. They wanted additional privacy, cheaper housing, detached houses from garages. They wanted driveways. They wanted free parking. They wanted superior suburban schools. And those are the main pull factors, environmental pull factors. Interregional migration in Timor-Leste, in Indonesia, we can see moving to economic activity in the city of Dili. Interregional migration between 2016 and 17. Most counties had population growth in 2016 and 17 are in the west. So we can see the population growth in the western states. And then the northeast Appalachia and parts of the South lost population. This shows the intra-regional migration from the city to suburbs. Interregional migration, also in the 21st century, we see counter-urbanization. Counter-urbanization is prevalent in areas that's rich in natural resources and amenities, such as the Rocky Mountain states of Colorado, Idaho, Utah, and Wyoming. We're starting to see people move outside the suburban areas. That's moving to outlying rural areas from the suburban areas. This shows you an example of counter-urbanization in the West. And again, we look at the percentage of Americans moving in a year. We see movement was greatest in the 1950s, and it steadily declined, except for the economic spike in the 1980s. to some regions in the U.S., but we've seen it steadily decline from 1990 to present day. Again, take this time to review these questions, write down the questions as you're taking notes.